for Dr. Rockhold. I was looking at the model data sharing agreement you have on your GSK site, and it does have a fair number of provisions regarding intellectual property. And so I was wondering whether, and this goes back to a question I think Steve asked earlier, to what extent do you envision this sharing as yielding new science versus checking on old science? In other words, checking to what you had done versus finding new uses, subgroups, and so forth and so on. Because it sounds like at least somebody who drafted this agreement envisioned a fair number of things that might lead to intellectual property.
It's a great question. I feel the same. I think you asked me the same question last fall. So, so hopefully I'll give the same answer. Yeah, I mean, I think rarely is the answer to your question. So I think on balance, is it going to be people wanting to redo old analyses versus look for new things? I would hope it's the latter. People wanting to understand or explain or look for baseline characteristics that explain different findings. So I would say it's, maybe that's somewhere in the middle. It's taking analyses that have already been done and trying to put them into context, maybe look at subgroups. But I think the people working on the project would say that the likelihood of a lot of new, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but my understanding of the likelihood of a lot of new intellectual property coming out of it is not really expected to be very large. But that is part of the data sharing. And the only criteria is that we just be allowed to use it, not that we're trying to profit from it. So.
Right, yeah, no, I mean, it was interesting to see that it's fairly well specified. It's a nicely drafted sample. I don't know what those, obviously the details of specific agreements may differ, but it was nicely drafted and clearly with attention to this question. So that's why I was interested.
The bigger issue I think that we are concerned about is people reanalyzing the data and finding a safety signal that we didn't see before or isn't in the label, and making sure they're attentive to either telling us, not either, both telling us and the regulatory authorities as soon as possible, because we'd like to see we find them all, but I don't think that's true. So somebody may have a different idea. So I think that's actually a bigger concern that's highlighted in the data sharing agreement.
I just want to respond quickly to this issue. I think we had to embrace both approaches. The idea of putting the data out there is to allow people to take a look and produce science however they want to pursue it. I think what was very interesting to us in the Medtronic project was that we hired two world-famous systematic review groups, gave them the exact same data, and they actually didn't come up with the same conclusions exactly. They were directionally similar, but they did different things. And I've come to believe that actually if you give clinical trial results to different groups, then the way their points of emphasis, the way that they'll present it, their interpretations may vary. We've come from a situation where we believe that there's one ground truth out of data that emerges from a trial, and that whoever holds it and publishes that initial article is announcing what that ground truth is. And as long as there was no malfeasance, that's what anyone would find if they were trying to replicate it. And I think it's just not quite right. Not that the primary endpoint shouldn't be able to be replicated, but there are points of emphasis, there's ways of presenting information, there's ways of interpreting it that might be shades different, that might lead to a public dialogue that could bring some difference. So in that way, I think the reproducibility is important, not as a gotcha exercise, as much as one to allow a full range of interpretations and analyses that might otherwise not be performed to promote the kind of public dialogue that we might be missing otherwise. So I just suggest about we embraced both on our side with regard to Johnson & Johnson. We've actually heard some remarkable questions for the J&J data that are entirely new for people who would have had to write grants and have somebody spend a lot of money in order to allow them to do it. The existing data permits that. There's others who are interested in delving in and looking at various different shades of the actual primary aim of what the data were collected for. And we've seen both, I think, have value. And I just want to echo what Frank said. We've spent a lot of time talking about this safety issue. This is dicey because on one hand, false positives can cause considerable harm. On the other hand, someone's finding something of importance that could provide information that could protect the public is equally important. And finding that right balance is not easy. With regard to the Medtronic project, if anyone has seen the systematic reviews, one of the review groups was leaning more towards raising questions about a cancer signal. And we were in a position with Medtronic, with the reviewers, trying to decide how to manage that information. And ultimately in discussions with the review group saying, how strongly do you believe this finding? I mean, is it an exploratory finding, or do you feel that this is something real? And, it's hard, I don't know, Frank, in your discussion, but it's hard to provide guidance, a protocol for this. I mean, it's a discussion. And in the end of the day, it was the feeling, and it came really from the reviewers who said, no, we think this is more of an exploratory finding than it is a definitive finding, however you want to define those terms. And so we allowed them to finish and published in Annals, not having called a press conference before and said, this is what they found. But these are the kind of things that are going to come up repetitively, where somebody finds something. And what we'll want to know, and the reason we have registration in our process, and you do too, is because we want to know, what did people say they were looking for? Because if they found something that they weren't initially looking for, we want to be able to interpret that in that context. And then there's a discussion about, when does it rise to the level of reporting to the FDA, calling a press conference, taking something off the market? All these things need standards and discussions. And I think ultimately some transparency about the process and external groups being involved so that we can have a process that we can trust in the end and recognize that harm can accrue by going too early or too late, and or going at all when you shouldn't go at all. And these are things that require our attention. It's not easy.
Great. So we have a number of questions teed up. Jeff, Tim, Bernie, and then Steve.
The data are out there, and I'm from 1-800, bad drug, and I want to access the database so I can bring suit against the owner. Have those people had the brass to come forward looking for data, or is that something, a simple question here? Have you heard from those folks?
With regard to data sharing, I couldn't, we've talked about this for many months before putting the site up, and decided that to try and make that as a filter, criteria, restriction was never going to work. I mean, a litigating law firm could hire the University of North Carolina to do a meta-analysis, and I'm not going to know who that's, that. So we decided if it's a valid scientific question and you have qualified people to do the analysis, that standard is going to stick regardless of whether you're from 1-800-BAD-DRUG, Pfizer, J&J, University of Texas, whatever. I mean, so that's the standard we decided to use, because otherwise I think it just becomes a slippery slope as to what's, it's kind of like hypothetically what's commercially sensitive. I think you get into the same debate, and I think we decided the idea of the spirit here was to disclose and be transparent, and if you set too many, it's just one more hurdle you could use to abuse the system. So we may have heard from them, but not as far as I know.
And I'll just say, in contrast, we explicitly state that the purpose of the data sharing is for scientific investigations, and specifically not for proprietary use or for litigation. Now, that being said, how far we can go with that and who hires who, but we are at least declaring that the data sharing is for the purpose of promoting science. There may be other mechanisms to obtain data. If you're interested in litigation, having a knowledge of litigators, they seem to have no shortage of ability to obtain data where they're looking for it. But this isn't what this is built for, and at least we're explicitly stating that's not the intent of this. This intent is to promote a responsible conduct of science, and that's our aspiration, and that's what we're trying to do.
Same aspiration, just different.
That was meant to be a quickie. Now, maintenance. We discussed it briefly this morning, but here you have all these data sets that you've imported from. Well, Harlan's imported from a third party, and they're GSK data sets, some of which may be a decade old or longer, and they've been deposited, and you now have call-outs for them. How hassle-free is that for the data depositor? Or do you know as soon as there's a request, within a month, the requester is going to be on the phone saying, I've got questions A, B, C, and D I need to resolve so I can understand the data. Have you been able to put together an adequate set of metadata so that you feel that, here it is, the instructions are maybe a little simpler than putting together a chest of drawers from IKEA, but that anybody that tries can do it?
Yeah, unlike IKEA, we actually use words in our instructions. But, um,
That may be the mistake.
so it's a great question. We are transporting all the data to the same standard. So it's our internal standard, which would look very much like CDISC to the outside world. With each data set comes the protocol, case report form, annotated case report form, metadata description, the clinical study report, statistical analysis plan, quoting, what, in other words, if it's a change from baseline, here are the names of the variables that implies. So,
Worked examples?
well, if it's been published, certainly yes, but, and the code, sorry. So, is that foolproof? I'm sure the answer to that is no. We're hoping it does prevent a lot of questions, and that is the primary reason why we do require the requester to have a qualified quantitative scientist, statistician, whatever, so that we can minimize the number of, because that would be, if we got 15 questions on every data set we released, it certainly would be draining. So we're trying to prevent that by giving as much documentation as possible and making sure the request is clear.
In your experience, and it's been almost a year now, slightly since the data, since your website opened, have you had, many requests, almost none?
We've had 100 for data?
No, for, somebody gets their data approved, they say, okay, you get access to the data, and person A gets, well-qualified researchers. I'm just trying to understand, you've gone to a lot of work, because one of the things that we're tasked to do is what should be in the metadata, and I'm trying to understand whether you've been at least reasonably successful in getting the data so clear that the number of questions has been minimized.
So I would say I think we've been reasonably clear, and I don't really get a sense from the people on the teams that they're getting overwhelmed by questions. I will say I think the tidal wave probably hasn't hit. I mean, we've gotten 100 inquiries. We've probably released, 20 of them been approved. 18 of those, sets of data have been released. So when the rest of the 100 go out, maybe that'll change. But I certainly have not gotten a sense from the teams that they've been overwhelmed by questions.
I think there's a big difference between looking back and looking forward and what we need to do to do this. I heard a lot of people tell me that there's no possible way anyone could understand my data except me and my team. That made me really concerned about the quality of the data and whether they could even be audited if someone says that. In our experience in the Medtronic project, 2 world expert groups, full data and metadata available for Medtronic, there were a fair number of questions. Now, I think the hope is you develop an FAQ list that diminishes over time, but I don't think there's any question, given the state of the documentation looking back and the fact that people weren't thinking that this was going to be for external audience going forward, there's going to be a fair burden of questions, and it's just a matter of trying to figure out how to minimize that. I think that's also happened at NIH as well.
So, I mean, good point. The questions aren't zero, and so I probably would say the effort post-release relative to the effort pre-release is not that great, but there's an enormous amount of effort that goes in before the data are released in order to document things. So I don't get a sense from the teams that they feel overwhelmed by the questions coming in, but that's relative to the amount of effort they put in up front.
So just one last question. Going forward, now, is it much easier because these things are going public? You've developed a template and a plan, and all your trials will be put together in such a way that they're easy to transport out and easy to understand?
Right. Yes, going forward, I mean, several things have happened. So as of January 1st, 2013, all of our informed consents require the patient to acknowledge the data we release. So a lot of the complexities we have to go through and triage to determine whether or not a trial can be released, we don't have to go with that. We have a common standard going forward now. So every trial, when the trial starts, everybody knows it's going to be released and they know what standard to put it in. So there's a lot less work at the back end. I mean, it's not dissimilar from when putting clinical trial summaries on clinicaltrials.gov. I mean, now people do that. They know they have to do it. So when they write the protocol, they start preparing the template for the summary, as opposed to going back in time for 2,000 trials is an enormous effort. But once that's out there, the maintenance will be a lot less. Does that help?
Thanks. Tim?
So start, let's assume we all start from the vantage point that we're doing this prospectively, and that we agree that this is all a public common good, that we should do this properly. So I'm interested, certainly Frank and Harlan, but for the panel, if we're coming to you and saying and ask you what are the attributes of an organization, a separate organization that you would be comfortable depositing your company's data or your data as an academic investigator, what are the attributes of that organization? Because we've talked a lot about creating an entity, but what does it look like?
I just want to ask for clarification on what you're saying. So there's a technical role that Frank's describing around who's going to manage the data.
Right.
And but there's another issue around who's got jurisdiction and authority over the release of the data. I'm just trying to understand your question.
So we probably, both of those will be vital.
So I mean, that's one of the reasons we're working with the Wellcome Trust to try and come up with around the governance model about who reviews the proposals, whether or not the data get released. I think the operational piece is far more complex, but in an odd way, clearer, in a sense. If you can find an organization that can manage large volumes of data, and then it becomes their job to figure out, well, Roche wants to combine their data with Harvard. Is that doable? How do we do? Are they using the same standard? Can we put that together? It's complicated, but that becomes a technical organization. I think the philosophical governing pieces are more difficult. So from our perspective, and we've had conversations with some organizations that, while we didn't set out with a list of rules or guidelines, what do we want these people to look like, the answers we got back told us they weren't the kind of organization, because they wanted to have a lot more control over release than we thought was appropriate. So I think if we went to an organization and they were, wanted to have a more open policy than we did, that's fine. We could deal with that, because now it's their responsibility to govern and maintain that. I think if we went to an organization that wanted to have more control, put more controls on releasing information, forcing more stringency or a finer filter, then I think we would become reluctant, because that's against so I think there are two pieces to it. It would be great if that was one institution or one organization. We're not there yet. And quite frankly, if somebody else came along with an organization said, I mean, I think the YODA model is great, the Immune Tolerance Network model is great, and if any of those organizations decided they could scale this to 5 million trials and do it, we don't want to be in this business long term. So we're happy to find somebody to do it. It's taken a long time to get where we are, and not through a lot of effort. It's not people are working really hard. It's a concept that it seems difficult for people to grasp. When you tell me I'm in charge of governance for releasing information, it's like, well, what am I responsible for? What if I get it wrong? What if I release something that I wasn't supposed to? There's a lot of subtleties and fineries in that. I'm sure Harlan would say the same thing.
If I could just sort of follow up, I think the other piece that we heard from Paul is there's a clear workforce issue around this as well. And so it's not just the creation of an entity. It sounds like manpower is the other critical gap that you have. And so you've conquered that sort of, but it sounds like you've had significant scaling to have to do around that.
Well, again, I just want to specify what you're talking about, because it can be understood in a wide range of areas. So if you're talking about clinical trials, that's a circumscribed area. I mean, if you're talking about sharing, like Mini Sentinel, or you're trying to figure out with PCORNet and others how you're going to manage a distributed data network, I mean, that's an entirely different form of data sharing. If you're talking about this kind of data sharing, I mean, I think that there are two functionalities that you want to promote, and each has their own areas of expertise and properties associated with them. And one, as Frank's telling you, is the governance piece of this. How do you hold it together? How do you work in public view, but, and be attentive to the concerns of a wide variety of stakeholders and ultimately to society's needs. And how do you do that in a way where you can learn iteratively and continue to improve it? Now, then, like Frank has, you have an organization like SAS, and there are a variety of other groups like that who are housing the data and managing the technical aspects of, how will you, when you do release, I mean, who's going to manage and mind that store and ensure that that's being done well and is responsible and so forth. And I think, you guys have divided that function. We've divided that function. And that is scalable, I think, with regard to the governance. It's just a matter of trying to figure out ways in which it's got to be, the stakeholders have to be there. I mean, in our steering committee, we sort of have brought that together, but it's a matter of, there just is a certain openness and trust that has to be there with everyone who's participating.
I mean, I can appreciate the comments that Paula made, and there are, in some ways, limited resource, but one of the reasons I keep emphasizing the standards component, right? If we actually commit to a standard way of collecting, accessing, and storing information, the workload goes way down. Right? One of the reasons for the workload now is that we're trying to retrofit trials we did 5-6 years ago, and that is what drives most of the workload. And I would say we have split the two, but I also think you need to be careful, and I think this has been mentioned by several others. There's a great saying by a good friend of mine, Stuart Pocock. He says, independence is a great thing, but when independence equals ignorance, you've gone too far, right? So you have to create a situation where you're independent, but that the independent body actually understands what you're trying to accomplish. So that means you actually have to talk to them, and make sure that everybody's in alignment with what you're trying to accomplish. So,
so then let's just say that I think the goal needs to be, the goal isn't data sharing. I mean, the goal is to create an open science environment that supports the generation of new knowledge in a way that we've been constrained about before, and creates a greater amount of trust and social capital with regard to the research enterprise, such that the results are more trustworthy, the debates are more vigorous, what can be yielded from the investments that have already been made and honoring the participation of the subjects is so much greater than it has been before. In that context, actually, it's not just an organization that can release data, but it's about us thinking broadly about the organization, archiving, accessing of the data, the granting of access, and what responsibilities and privileges are associated with that, and finding ways to fund and support and catalyze creativity in data that currently exists, for which great funds have already been spent, which may provide at least the foundation for testing new hypotheses, which then can undergo further validation in a more advanced study. And we have to see that whole piece together, because if all we've done is release data and spent a lot of money doing it, but it's not being used to any great utility, and we could be wasting money. I mean, we could actually be slowing the scientific enterprise and meshing it in wasteful efforts. So we've got to be thinking about how all of that fits together from my perspective.
So I think one way to address the resource problem, but it is correct if you say going forward. Let's ignore the retrospective piece for a second. The less we fragment this effort, the less resources will become an issue. I mean, if every institution has to go find 3 quantitative scientists that know how to store and archive, yes, then we're going to run out of resources very quickly, because that's going to limit the number of people.
I think Phil probably has comments about his notion of a digital enterprise that I'd like to hear about.
So I just wanted to comment on the resource issue that relates to the people. This was touched on by Paula with the training, and perhaps it's not such in these smaller studies, but in the larger networks you're pointing out, I think there are two sets of issues. One is actually retaining the people we already have, where a significant amount of money has already been spent on training them to be data scientists in this capacity. And then the second one is what we do to really ramp up to meet the needs going forward. And I think the first one actually requires some real thinking about, within the academic setting, essentially what it means to be a data scientist in those settings. And I think those, for the most part right now, a lot of those people are very underappreciated within the system. And I think we really need to sort of educate effectively the academic enterprise to take better care of these people. And then, of course, one of the things that we're very seriously looking at through the Big Data to Knowledge and other initiatives is what we do with training going forward. Because when I left San Diego 9 weeks ago, that just at that time, just in that area alone, was a shortage of 4,500 data scientists that could have been employed tomorrow or yesterday. But certainly the university and the other institutions around were not training enough people to take these jobs. So clearly there's a mismatch there.
Partly because we don't have the trainers at our faculties to do the training. Bernie and then Steve.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Harlan and Frank to sort of share with us your thoughts about lessons learned. So you've had a lot of experience, spent a lot of time and energy thinking about these issues, and you've sort of said some things already. I mean, Harlan, you mentioned that it's important to separate the question of, what are you talking about responsibility for deciding who gets access to data versus management and paying attention to the needs of stakeholders. And Frank, you sort of said pay attention to multiple regulatory regimens around the world. Are there other things that you would want to sort of put out there as a lesson learned for other people just getting into the data sharing, of clinical trials data sharing business, or to us as we're thinking about eventually making recommendations? What lessons learned would you like to tell us?
I'll just say that we've been entirely fortunate that the entire experience has been very positive, and I credit our advisors and the fact that we have been guided by these principles that I mentioned to you that I think have to be part of whatever you do, which is we were committed to data sharing. We were committed to doing things that we felt would promote the responsible conduct of research. So ultimately, we wanted to strengthen the scientific enterprise in whatever we did, and we wanted to be very vigorous advocates for the patients and subjects that were part of these studies. And so we wanted to be very cognizant of it. And whenever we were facing decisions, we would always go back to those three principles and figure out what we wanted to do. And then we were always trying to think about the end game. And the end game is to foster new knowledge that could be in the service of patients and the public. And that meant that in attending to this and in recognizing that we're not trying to create a one-off, but we're trying to create this journey that Frank mentions, then we've got to be thinking about all of these. How do you do this most efficiently? How do you bring in the talent that you need to get it accomplished? And I mean, just saying in terms of the lessons for us, these are the constant conversations that we would be having, and how could we configure this so that it would be likely to be embraced by the data owners and by the data users and by the public at large, and serve a useful purpose. And all of those things were the kind of things that shaped our thinking at every step. And whenever we reach a difficult decision, and Deb was on these steering committee calls with us many times where we were trying to make a choice, we would just reflect back on that and just say, there's no perfect choice, but this one's best aligned with these principles, and then let's go for it, recognizing if we've made a mistake, we can change. I mean, we're not tied to this. We'll learn from it and then keep moving.
So I would say several lessons learned. Some of them we learned a long time ago. So if you think about, as I said, this has been an 11-year journey. Just if you sort of break down the complexities and the challenges in this problem, one is the philosophical behavioral challenge, like, wait a minute, this is my data, you can't have it, versus the technical challenge, the logistics challenge. If you take the first ones, actually can be tougher, right? Well, but for us, we've been doing this for a long time, so the challenge of, I have to post my protocol to clinicaltrials.gov, or I have to put my results out there, or put my protocol, or I have to publish every trial, I have to put my protocol out there. We faced those issues for a long time ago, and actually, when we decided to move to this, there was very little resistance in the organization because the concept of disclosure and transparency was well embedded. The logistics part is a resourcing issue. The organization recognized that was an issue, and so tried to put some financial might behind it to try and solve that. So I think I guess I'd say the lesson learned over time was when you run a clinical trial, and we focus on trials, we don't focus on the big data. We decide observational data, we don't own that, so it's a little difficult for us to decide who can have it and who can't because we didn't. But for trials we sponsored, when you run a trial, view a trial as a sacred piece of information that someone else is someday going to want to use. So put it in a form that someone can find it, because I think you owe that to the patient the moment they sign an informed consent. So I think those are lessons but that took a lot of ingraining and it took a lot of time over time. The logistics part, while complicated, are solvable. I think the philosophical and behavioral pieces take more time, but I think now people accept that as just the way of doing business. So I think I agree with Harlan. I said it's been, actually for the last couple of years, have been an extremely positive experience. I think people are looking for ways to solve it as opposed to ways to, trying to throw hurdles in the way. But it is a challenge. So I guess I also quoted some other lessons around treating the clinical trials information as sacred. Put it in a standard way. Put it in a way where you can find. If you can't find it, it isn't useful. So, and I agree completely with what Philip says. Don't underestimate the value of the people who know how to do that, because it's not exciting, exotic work. But if you don't do it right, you've basically, I think, you've violated your basic agreement with the research enterprise and the patient.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Have you had many patients who said, I'll be in the trial, but I don't want to have my data, so I won't sign consent?
Jeff, I have not heard of any. That doesn't mean it's never happened, but no one has.
Trial enrollment hasn't rolled to a halt.
No.
Steve?
Well, because I waited, I think all my questions were basically answered. I was going to talk about how much less it would cost if we, planned it from day one. You haven't put a number on that, but I gather there are, it's a lot less. Can you put an order of magnitude? 1/5 the cost? 1/10? I mean, I imagine it.
I do that occasionally.
I had thought for government employees you were prescribed from doing it.
I would say I mean, this is a really crude estimate, but if it's going to take us, 15 to 20 people to get the rest of the 2,000 trials that go back to the year 2000 on the site by the end of next year, and we're saying we need 4 to 6 people to maintain it, I mean, that might give you
It's maintenance.
rough.
Now, are the trials going forward, for example, one area where I can imagine you get some efficiency is if they are de-identified in real time. So you have sort of 2 parallel data sets. Are you doing things like that?
We're looking into it. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to come up with a standard de-identification module. The privacy challenges are much greater around the CSRs. Actually, finding a mechanized technological solution to auto redacting CSRs would be
how critical do you view the inclusion of the CSR in your data set?
It's not for me to judge. I mean, there are people who think it's absolutely essential and others who I don't know, but I mean, we include it.
Could you do that? How often is that really accessed or requested? Could you do that on a case-by-case basis?
We give it out when we give the data set.
I see.
I don't.
Okay.
As a statistician, I would say I would probably not look at it a lot, but but there's lots of people who think the CSR is a valuable document.
Yeah. The other question is probably answered. It was Bernie's question, but I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way. He said what lessons were learned, and he gave very positive answers. But Harlan, both Harlan, you and Frank, you talked about speed bumps, logistical issues. Are there any, aside from the things that are going to come up when anybody would do it, are there ones that we need to be particularly aware of that we would reasonably have to foresee and incorporate in any of our recommendations?
this isn't about our speed bump, but if you ask me what you guys can do most is to get the academic institutions to catch up with industry. Because, we're in this uncomfortable situation where industry has led in such a remarkable way over the last several years. And academic institutions, will not engage generally. I mean, in my experience, either with AAMC or any deans I've talked to, I mean, they do not want to engage in this issue. They want to pretend it doesn't exist, and do not want to be accountable for even the percent of their trials that are registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And we know that based on research we've done, that 30% of the NIH trials aren't published after 3 years, which was then validated by the NIH in a replication study in the New England Journal, which was great, that showed that that was true. And that is a problem that resides primarily in academic institutions. And it's hard for us to get traction in that area. With regard to any other issues, I mean, I don't think you can make a mistake. It's just about getting started and being willing to learn and modify. And there are already enough models out there to sort of build on what Frank's done. We're happy to share everything, of course. And I think that it's just a matter of trying to make some progress. If we can get some standards, I think it will make things a lot easier. And as we look forward, I think it will be better. But the place where there is an embarrassing lack of engagement right now is in the academic institutions.
So I think another one, I agree with everything Harlan said. I think another place we spent many years literally trying to get around the patient privacy, data privacy issues, very complex issue. And I guess I would encourage people to think about, maybe it's because it's the way my brain is trained, think about, well, if in any action you take, there's a probability or likelihood that the data can be de-identified, and whatever level that is, you can estimate that, you can model it, and get it down to as small a level as you can, but then counter that with the likelihood that actually having somebody look at these data will improve the life of some future patient. So it's not I think for a long time people were, if the risk of data privacy isn't zero, we can't do this. Well, it's never going to be zero, so there's some scale upon which you can look at this versus the potential gain in looking at data and learning new things or whatever as people describe them. So I would think, to me, you look at it as, I want to figure out a way to disclose data. Therefore, I'm going to manage this issue to a place that gets me to minimize the risk. And do that by talking to patient groups, with all due respect to my legal colleagues, don't only talk to lawyers about it, because you get seriously, that's what it drives people down to the decision, well, don't do it. And so I think that we got a lot of really good legal advice from external data privacy people and from patient groups about, well, what does constitute a concern to you? And I think helped us arrive at and most going forward is an issue. You go back 15 years and try to say, well, would this patient have minded if I released their data? That's a very complex set of questions.
Actually, I do have one question that wasn't asked, which is we focused on, have you had any experience of harm? I'd actually like to ask the reverse question. Based on the data that you have shared, not the sort of just theoretical issues, are there demonstrable examples of benefit from data that you have shared? And Harlan pointed to the subtle but real difference in the BMP reviews. But besides those,
I can't honestly say. That's probably too soon to have even seen the outcome of what people have done or what they've published. So I honestly don't think I would be in a position to answer that question. I actually think all disclosure and transparency has an indirect benefit, because I think it forces researchers in the first instance to do a better job designing trials and data collection mechanisms when they know the rest of the world's also going to be looking at what they're doing. So actually, to me, that's an improvement. I'm guessing that's probably already taken place. It's just we haven't seen the fruits of it yet.
And on the Medtronic project, we've heard from many, many people that the clarification of what is known and what could be known from the dual systematic reviews and I think, social capital that was created by the knowledge that anyone could repeat those analyses or, through the thing has been, I think, considerable. And I got a lot of emails from patients and lots of people who felt that this information, they were glad that this information was out in the open. I just want to give one point of clarification about this academic center thing. It cannot be done without accompanying it, and I know you know this, with an effort to figure out how to give credit to the people who have spent so much time generating the, the data in the first place. And, you know, I think that more than publications, if someone has 1,000 people publishing off of data that I created, then I must have created something of great value. That needs to be credited in a way that you know, we haven't yet achieved. So that's a problem to solve. And I just want to accompany my comment about the academic standards by that notion that we need to figure that piece out.
We talked about that this morning.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can I address that briefly? I wasn't here this morning, so stop me if I'm being repetitive. But first of all, I take what you said about the academic medical centers as an action item for the NIH, and there's no question that this was on my agenda, you know, but it didn't come up in the first 9 weeks, but it will. Next week it'll be solved. No, but this issue of reward, which does seem to be a critical issue, and it's something that I think first of all, how we describe data and how it can be cited within the academic framework is obviously clearly a very important first step. And then once we have a mechanism, it's the recognition of that mechanism. And you know, certainly this is something that there's a lot of recognition of within the NIH. There's certainly a number of efforts going on in data citation, and I think the idea that that becomes, that the NIH supports the recognition that that's an important part of scholarship, that, you know, you could do, some simple things can happen in a relatively short time. If you just had a way of actually very easily seeing who was using your data sets and what they had to say about them, that would actually go a long way towards this. And in fact, the Data Discovery Index, which is one of the things that's currently going to be, is on the cards to be awarded and implemented, will begin to address this issue.
Devin?
So on the topic of, back on the topic of data de-identification, we are having a commissioned paper written for us on that topic, but I'm wondering if there's more that you can share in terms of the challenges, and in particular, a question has come up from time to time about whether HIPAA standards for de-identification, which are often certainly looked to here in the United States, is the right lens, or what is it, one lens or the right lens to be thinking about these issues when we're trying to serve an international community with our recommendations, if you have any thoughts on that. And then the second thing would be, oftentimes with de-identification, a number of research that I've talked to have had concerns about the utility of the data in de-identified format. And if those concerns have existed in your projects, what would you advise us to think about in that regard?
So I think these are excellent points in a big data construct. They have I think are more debilitating when you're sort of limited the other kinds of data that could potentially come in and merge and match and provide sort of a richness of context that then you might use for discovery of kind of information, even going to, if you had genomic information, obviously, then that has all those issues associated with it. I can say, at least as a first level effort, we find that people have some very basic questions that existing data can answer for them, that can get them moving and advance their understanding to a point where they may then go to the next level. And, you know, I think we're going to have to take what we can get. And given the nature of the consents going past, I think we have to be very conservative in terms of what's available and try to find the sweet spot of the questions that fit it best. But going forward, we might be able to allow for special exemptions for people who go through certain mechanisms that can get more data that might provide a richer environment. But that's where I sort of have seen it. But with regard to the 2 reviews that were done for Medtronic, totally de-identified data, I think in that case they're replicating, but it was still very valuable, and there was no constraints on it because it was a narrow kind of question that they were answering. I don't know.
I think it's very intriguing, the thought of identified versus de-identified data. And you can certainly learn a lot of secondary analysis from de-identified data, but if you really want to link trials and knowing the populations that move across the country and also the trials that are similar, then having identified data will be very helpful. And that, of course, isn't really being addressed and is probably, you know, the beta version 2 of what's happening with Yoda and GSK and a lot of the other things that are moving on, because now I think you're doing a yeoman's task here with the patient confidentiality, but if we can identify data, those probably would have to be in more restrictive outlets. I mean, I have a trial going on now that if I could only get identified data, I could do a lot less work, but that's not going to happen.
So I'll answer your second question first. So one of our principles was, as long as you can retain the longitudinal nature of a patient record, then and that was pretty much what most researchers are interested in. So if we could go in, strip out the basic personally identifiable information, replace their patient number with a new patient number, so you couldn't even go back to the clinic and match their records, but you can still follow their longitudinal record and match their efficacy data, their adverse events, et cetera. So we've heard very little pushback on that because the researchers can maintain that patient record. Once you get away from that, yes, it becomes of questionable use, I think, to the researcher. In terms of your first question, we didn't address HIPAA per se. I mean, we were trying to deal with global data privacy issues. Some of the ones in Europe are even a bit more challenging. So we came up with a triage mechanism that we've shared with a number of people, basically trying to use the informed consent, in a sense, as the driver for, if the informed consent said you cannot share the data, then of course we would say, okay, we're not going to share it. Now that is pretty unusual. If you go back 10 years, most consents were silent, right? So if the informed consent was silent, we had a review by some internal and external medical folks and said, well, what are the boundaries on a reasonable reuse of these data? So if it's a diabetes study and you want to look at hypertension, people would say, well, that's a reasonable reuse of the data. If you're doing a study of, it's a 100-patient study and you want to look at the incidence of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, that's probably not a reasonable reuse of these data. So therefore, that's probably not something the patient would have thought was a reasonable use of their data. So we have a triage mechanism to go through and say, would we release? How would we de-identify? There are some places that lead you to total encryption and anonymization, which of course is not very useful to the researcher, and so they usually don't want that. So we've tried to come through with basically a probability triage mechanism that we review with an external legal counsel to try and get around the historical piece. I hope that helps.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Bernie, did you have a question or?
I do. Can I follow up with a line of discussion? I think Harlan and Philip were having a couple minutes ago with regard to academic health centers and needing to bring them up to speed with what some people in the industry like GSK and J&J have done. And we tried to address this in a panel earlier, but I'd like to sort of get your thoughts with a little more specificity. You said that first we have to have a way of just tracking use of data, sort of knowing what's been used by whom. And then secondly, you said, well, you need to then see what the products are. And I wanted to ask Harlan and Frank whether you think it's part of your responsibility or remit to, on one level, just provide back to the original clinical trialists the listing of who's used your data so they could use that for whatever promotion purposes they wanted. But also, is there a way of taking what you know about who's used the data and presumably facilitating tracking on what's been published to look at what contribution has the data sharing made to science? I mean, Harlan, you raised the point that really the goal of this is to sort of foster and promote discovery. And so just that because it was shared and just because it was published doesn't really mean it was a real contribution. But so these are all steps on the way. And Philip, you said you're sort of going to work on this next week and solve it for us. But can you talk through sort of how do we actually make that happen? Because right now, I take it it's pretty much up to the individual investigator who wants to get promoted or something to say, look, I put a lot into sharing data, making it widely useful, but it's kind of hard for me to document because, it's hard for me to get a hold of that information. So help us out with some things that could start along that path.
I mean, there are emergent methodologies within the scholarship community that there are things like total impact, which sort of begin to I mean, I think the internet sort of helps us because at one level things can be found, and when they can be found, they can be quantified, and then they can be credited to someone. So we're starting to see that kind of thing happen. The problem is it's not very reliable. And until we have, better quantification of the different articles of scholarship that are out there on the internet and that they can be identified and valued, we're still going to have a very qualitative measure at one level. But it's clear that that is going to get better over time.
And what could one do, what could any actor do to sort of push that process of quantifying and sort of putting a value on the?
Well, I think one of the ideas that we're talking about within the NIH is how if we take our various research objects, so these are data sets, these are discussions about that data, which might be papers themselves, it could be something else, pieces of software, whatever those individual research objects might be, how we're going to identify them. Obviously, there are schemes already in place for some of this through digital object identifiers. Should we extend that to all research objects? Should we use a different URI scheme? These are sort of technical aspects, but I think we need to make a decision about how we're going to identify them. That would, to me, be a first step, and I could actually see that would have profound impact beyond what actually happens in terms of measuring scholarship. Just that mere identification, and we could get into that, but that's a sort of different process. It actually could potentially relate to reproducibility, of course. But
right. This is how, if I could ask another follow-up question. So is this an activity that you envisage the NIH potentially playing a role, at least for the studies you fund, but by developing the methodology, presuming other people could use it? Or as you look at all the other things you're being asked to do with a flat budget shrinking in real terms, is this sort of down on the list?
no, I mean, I think this is actually perhaps number one on the list because of exactly those reasons. And I kind of missed the mark when I was describing what it was we were going to do. And the session's actually taken a completely different turn, but that's okay. But I mean, I think, to solve the sustainability problem, we have to really maximize the value in the digital enterprise to make us as cost effective as possible. And it seems to me that the very first step in doing so is really to identify the assets that we have and then use those assets effectively. So it's actually the first step. And we will be, I mean, obviously this goes on in different contexts already. There are already identifiers for what's in clinicaltrials.gov. There's PubMed identifiers and so on. So we need to coalesce some of these things and decide as an organization how we're going to sort of move forward in using them. But I think coming up with, at least, it doesn't have to be universal, but one has to map to the other. So, that's going to be perhaps the foremost thing that we're going to be doing in the next year, I would say.
So I couldn't agree more. Look, the underlying premise here is that we should be doing research better, faster, cheaper. The current scientific research enterprise is inadequate to keep up with the needs of patients, the public, clinicians, researchers, administrators, policymakers. There's just no way we can do it, and yet we're wasting valued assets that exist but are beyond the reach of many individuals. This is a first step forward to try to make that available. We have to be entirely accountable for this because there needs to be a return on this investment because it is an investment. In the future, you want to try to build it into the regular way in which data are archived and accessed so that you reduce the marginal cost. You want to be able to make it so that trials and research can be audited more easily. I think it's going to raise the level of research throughout if you know that it's more generally shared and that there are these standards that exist, which right now I can't tell you how much they're being violated every day, let alone just on the non-publication. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But to be able to really get in and understand, have other people touch the data and look at it and understand it, and to see what it is going to transform quite a lot. On the academic side, I think that there are many areas here that need attention. The credit's one side. The lack of funding to do this is on the other side. I can't believe that we've got IRBs. Bernie, the leading expert in bioethics in the country. You tell me how you can approve as an IRB that people can study humans, but not hold them accountable for doing anything with the data that they've collected. And how can then you, in the next iteration, approve them for the next study when you don't take any knowledge of what happened on the past study? And what I said to Picori was, you can think about how this was received, but what I suggested to Picori was, do not give a grant to an institution that does not have an explicit public policy of being accountable, that for every study that they've conducted on human subjects, that's a trial experiment, they will have registered in clinicaltrials.gov, they will commit to report the results within 12 months, and that they will make a sincere attempt to publish the findings in a peer-reviewed publication and can be accountable for doing that. And if they won't, we shouldn't give them a PCOR grant, not just for the thing they've just applied for, but that they are disqualified for competing for our money. And as a PCOR Board of Governors, they're disqualified for competing for my money, our money, PCOR money, unless they,
Our money.
it's my money, unless they, I've been on the board too long. No, but it's the public's money, right? And what? In part, that's right. And in part from trust, but we should be saying, look, in order to be able to be eligible, you've got to be part of a scientific community that's exhibiting the professionalism that we expect. And if you're not, then you shouldn't be doing it. And I think in the NIH, it would be politically challenging to do that, but in PCORI may be a little bit easier, but even PCORI was reluctant to do that. But to me, it seems like a simple step. All we're asking them is register, report, and make a sincere attempt to publish. And be able to defend that you've done that with every one of the human experiments that you've conducted on your campus. And that has received a ton of resistance.
So I can't let an opportunity go by, although I'll duck the epithets you gave me. I think there is a role for the IRB, because remember, the IRB is broadly charged with protecting human subjects and determining that the risks of the research are acceptable in light of the projected benefits of carrying out the study. And if you don't finish the study, you don't publish it, it's kind of hard to see where the benefits are. You're also supposed to assess the quality, the ability of the investigators to carry out the study. And if you failed in your previous studies to sort of generate generalizable knowledge. So, you know, a simple thing just to say as part of your IRB application, in the last studies we approved, what was the publication? Did you share the data? In your consent form, ask the IRB to say, do you have a provision, as Frank's saying, for data sharing, at least in clinical trials going forward? And if you don't, either give a really good explanation or this should be factored in to, do we approve a clinical trial if the only use is going to be by your team and not broadly? So these are all potential things that could have an impact. But
Just one item. I mean, we've on a small scale, when we get release data from a proposal, part of the data sharing agreement states we will send you the publication, primary publication that was made for this trial, and we not only expect you to publish the results of what you're doing, we expect you to reference the original. I mean, I know that sounds like basic scientific etiquette, but we intend to track that. We have all the requests and the status of them are public on the website. So, and it actually follows up on I think a suggestion that Jeff Drazen made at the meeting last fall, is that referring to the source of your data is really no different than referencing a publication. If you're going to use data from some source, it's behooving to you, I think, to say where you got it from and give credit to the people who did the studies.
So being at an academic health center, I agree that we should be held accountable and responsible, but it isn't that simple, is it? What if you're a site PI for a big trial and you recruited really well, but the rest of the trial didn't? You're going to shut off funds to that investigator or that university who held up their end of the bargain? And how are you going to make those decisions? And what other level of regulation are you going to put on for the reporting standards? That's another unfunded mandate to do it. So I do believe we have to hold people accountable. But as we become trial networks, as we reach out and collaborate, that becomes harder and harder to do for a study.
I think the answer is who's got jurisdiction over the data. And we're talking about the 30% non-publications on completed trials. So someone has to be responsible, and that person, if they're not located at a university, that's different. But for whoever got responsibility, it seems reasonable to expect that.
Well, thank you all for, are we?
Also, I mean, I'm not saying deny funding. Harlan took it a step beyond where I'd want to go right now. But at least to explain to an IRB in a non-regulatory way, it's a factor for them to take into account. Okay, you know, I was willing to publish and I got turned down by the steering committee. But, you know, just to sort of not even look at it strikes me maybe you're not going far enough. Devin,
But it does bring up the risk that despite people's best efforts, some things probably shouldn't be published. That maybe was a great design on the front end, but the interpretation at the different sites made it so that it really wasn't something that you could publish with any confidence. So what we don't want to promote is bad science or publishing the results, you know, and perhaps maybe the way around that is you publish your results as this is all the things that went wrong and that's why we can't make any meaningful conclusions. Really sorry, but maybe you could learn from this. I mean, I think there's way too much inside baseball in all of these trials anyway, where you could read the paper, but 5 minutes with the PI probably informs you more about what really happened, what is reliable in the paper, what they have the most confidence in, than reading the paper 10 times. So perhaps the way we publish has to be changed as well, so that there isn't so much insider information in how to interpret the results of a paper.
Well, thank you for a very full discussion. Give the panelists an opportunity if you wish to comment on presentations in the last session that I know you all sat through as well. Anyone have any final comments?
I think Philip's week 10 at the NIH is going to be a doozy.
Can't tell you how much fun I'm having so far.
Bernie, turn it back to you.
yeah, so I want to thank our four panelists for very conversation. And, you know, one of you said this is a journey, and we're in this with you at least until December of this year when we're topped out. But thanks very much. We greatly appreciate it.